All right, everybody, welcome back to We Slay Dragons. I'm your host, Saigan, also known in the real worlds as Steven. I realized I signed off last time. I introduced myself as one name and then I signed off as another. Saigan Cat is what I go by on my Dragon Quest channel. That's neither here nor there. I answer to either one. Today, we're going to learn how to actually play Alpha Strike using the quick start rules. There's going to be a couple of small changes. There's some weird stuff in here that we'll talk about. In fact, you know what? I think it'll actually come into play. No, it's the heat phase stuff. The heat phase has some interesting things in there that I think are probably in error. But anyways, let's start with just the beginning of each turn. You've got the initiative phase. Initiative is super stinking easy. Both sides roll 2d6. Whoever has the higher number wins initiative. Now, in Battletech, both Alpha Strike and Classic, everything effectively happens at the same time. Whoever wins initiative goes second, and that is because it allows them to have more battlefield awareness. So if everything's effectively happening at the same time, like damage doesn't take effect until the end of the damage phase, but if you move your mechs after your opponent moves your mechs, and you fire after your opponent fires, you have a better idea of what is going on, so you're able to make better choices. So that's why. Now, in terms of the initiative, it's I go, you go. Whoever loses initiative has to move one of their mechs, and then whoever won initiative moves one of theirs, and then it goes back to whoever lost. They move one of theirs, and then whoever won moves one of theirs. Whoever won initiative will always take the last move. Now, you might have a situation where you've got twice as many mechs on one side than the other. And at the beginning of each round of initiative, what you do is you check and see if there is a clear-cut number or a clear-cut multiplier of mechs on one side versus another. So in this case, let's say we've got our attackers over here, our defenders over here. Defenders won initiative, so I remember. In this case, the loser would have to move first. There are currently 4 mechs that they have to move, and the other side has 2 mechs. So they have 2 mechs to every 1. Since it's a clean multiple, they would move 2 mechs, then the other side would move 1, 2, and 1. Now, sometimes you don't have a clean multiple of mechs, and this happens once mechs start dying. Until you have that clean multiple, you still just go one at a time. So say we've got 5 over here and 3 over here. 5 is not a clean multiple of 3. So you'd start off by moving 1, and then 1, and then you check again. And it's 4 to 2, 2 to 1. Now you move 2 to their 1, 2 to their 1. It's super simple. There's a chart for it in the book. I feel like just looking at it this way is easier. You move one at a time until there's a clean multiple of mechs there. So after initiative phase, you've got your movement phase, and that's when you actually start moving your mechs. Now, on the Alpha Strike card, I'm going to put this out here. You probably can't read it, but go ahead and check your own Battletech cards, or you know what, I might throw something up there so it's easier to see. Reading the Battletech card is super easy. You've got the name and the model number. The model number of the mech is right above the name. So this, for instance, is a Hatchet Man. Hatchet Men have had several different models. Most battle mechs have had different models. The game can be played in many different eras, and each of those eras can have different variants of mechs. Some of them stronger, some of them weaker than the others. Some of them just have interesting options compared to the others. So we've got the Hatchet Man. He has a PV of 24. That's his point value. and it gives you a rough idea of how good this mech is. Alpha Strike is balanced by PV. When you're playing with somebody, you usually decide on a PV limit ahead of time for how much you want to be using. For a small game, you'll see something like 200 PV. For a larger game, you'll see 500, maybe more. Alpha Strike moves pretty quick, even in larger games. So, you know, experiment with your friends. I would start off with like 200 PV for your first game, just to keep things flowing, keep things moving quickly. Then you've got a couple more stats over here. TP is the type of unit that it is. BM stands for battle mech. We're going to focus on just battle mechs for a while here on this channel before we start introducing things like infantry and aerospace assets. But battle mechs are going to make up the majority of what you'll typically see playing Battletech, because we're all here for the giant stompy robots. Size. This is a size 2. That size also represents what class of mech that it is. You've got lights, mediums, heavies, and assaults. 1, 2, 3, and 4. The size also represents how much damage they do in melee, how much damage they do with a charge, how much damage they do with a death from above, and it can also affect how strong buildings are. We'll get to that later. But you can play with buildings having a certain level of structural integrity where they can only support up to so much of a size of a mech. So say it has a size limit of 2 and you have suddenly your hatchet man standing on it. He's a size of 2. Right now this building is fine, but if something else jumps onto it, that building is going to collapse, and it's actually going to cause damage to the mechs who fall from it and kill infantry who are inside. So that's a fun advanced rule to play with later on. And that's one of the things that size is used for. TMM, that is your target movement modifier, and what that tells us is how much harder this mech is to hit. And they get that TMM so long as they move 1 inch or more from the point that they started at the beginning of that turn. So if the hatchet man wants that TMM, he moves 1 inch, and then we know that he has walked or run or jumped 1 inch. And so long as he's moved 1 inch away from his starting point, he gets a TMM of 1 and he becomes 1 harder to hit. Now, if he only moves half an inch, or like shuffles to the side 1/4 of an inch, or even just jumps in place, that does not go towards his target movement modifier, and he's actually considered to be standing still if that happens, which means he has a TMM of 0 for that turn, so he's easier to hit, but he's also going to get a modifier on his attack roll that makes it easier for him to shoot. So there's some give and take there. Sometimes you'll want to move your mechs, sometimes you won't. That TMM is going to be based on their maximum possible movement, which we'll look at next. So the Hatchet Man has a movement of 8 inches. That is the most that he can move in a turn. You want to always measure from the same edge to edge. So say this Hatchet Man, let's move this forest, wants to move his full 8 inches. Well, we will measure from the front edge, or you can measure from the back edge, and you want to make sure that that front edge doesn't travel any more than 6 inches, or the back edge, or the center, or wherever you're measuring from. So long as you're always measuring from the same point of the model or of the base, it will be a fair movement. And then he's going to move another 2. And this time I'll measure from the back edge because it's still showing that no part of the mech is moving more than those 2 inches. So total, we've moved 6 and 2, 8 inches. He gets his target movement modifier, and then his movement would be done. Sometimes you will get different things after the movement. Now for mechs, that's pretty much always just going to be a J if they have jump jets. And jump jets allow them to, well, jump. The nice thing about jumping is that you can move or you can ignore certain terrain modifiers. Like normally if you're passing through forest, it costs you an additional inch of your movement for every inch through the forest that you're moving. So a hatchet man that has a movement of 8 can really only walk 4 inches through a forest if he starts off at the very edge. But because he has a jump, he can also jump 8 inches and just ignore that movement penalty for passing through the forest. That jump is also going to grant him an additional +1 on his TMM. So if he were to jump 8 inches, his TMM would effectively be a 2 that turn. But it would also be even harder for him to shoot afterwards. I think it's a +2. We'll verify that here shortly. It's been a while since I've actually sat down and played a proper game of Alpha Strike, but I'm pretty sure it's +2. We'll get there in the combat phase. So jumping makes you harder to hit, lets you ignore a lot of terrain modifiers, and on top of that, it makes it harder for you to shoot as well. Now, as far as jump height is concerned, the maximum height of your jump can be no more than half of your jumping movement. So since he's at 8 inches, he can't actually jump any more than 4 inches vertical. So we've got this building here, which is 2 inches. This building is 3 inches. Say it was a taller building. We have a 5-inch building here. He would not be able to clear this because he can only jump 4 inches high and 8 inches across. As soon as it's 3 inches, sure, he can jump on top of it just fine. Continuing on the card, his role is that of a brawler. A role basically tells you how the mech likes to operate in combat. If you're playing with lance abilities, then you can build lances and they'll have certain kinds of requirements. A lance is a formation of 4 mechs. It's basically like a squad of mechs. Inner Sphere lances consist of 4 units. Clans use 5 units. Comstar or Comguards use 6. It depends on the military structure of which faction you're playing. For your early games, you probably won't use a lot of those lance abilities, but they do add a lot to the game when you start to incorporate them. And it's something else that we'll get to later. Skill. Skill is your overall ability with the mech. The default skill, especially when you're going through master unit list and you're looking at points, is going to be skill 4. For the quick start rules, this Hatchet Man is actually a skill 3, and that is also reflected in his point value. If he were a skill 4, he'd actually be cheaper than 24 points. So if there's a couple of mechs that you want to get into your unit, and say you're a little bit over, you and your friend have agreed to play a 200-point game, you're a little bit over 200 points, there's probably a mech of yours that you could make their skill a little bit worse. Like, you know, you could drop the Hatchet Man to a skill 4 instead of a skill 3, lower his point value, and you'd fit in with the points. Alternatively, say you're sitting at like 185 skill or 185 points, and you want to be able to, you know, get closer to that 200, but you don't have any more mechs or there's nothing else that really fits into it. You can look at some of your mechs and increase their skill. Maybe take something from skill 4 to skill 3, maybe to skill 2. And we'll get to skill and how important it is when we get to the combat step. The next section down is going to be damage at different ranges. So he does 2 damage at a short range, 2 damage at a medium range, and can't do any damage at long range. Next bar down, we've got OV. That is your overheat value. That is how much heat you can spend to increase your damage by 1 at short and medium range. They have to have a special ability called OVL in order to overheat at long range. Your heat scale is right here. 1, 2, 3, and shutdown. Unless you're using overheat or your opponent is using heat weapons or there's some kind of weird terrain effect, you probably won't see heat scale too much in your early games. You'll definitely start seeing it get used more and more as you start incorporating more variety of mechs and interesting scenarios to your gameplay. And we'll get to those modifiers later. Armor and structure is exactly that. Armor is how many points of protection it has before you get to structure. Once you hit structure, if structure's all gone, the mech is destroyed. Every time a mech takes structure damage, they also have a chance of getting a critical hit. We'll cover that when we get to combat. And then you've got your specials. This one in particular has AC 1, 1, and nothing. That means it's got an autocannon at short and medium range at 1 value each. What's fun about the autocannon and SRMs and various different types of weapon specials is that you can change out their ammunition types if your opponents have agreed to play with that rule. So that can also add a lot of flexibility to your game. He also has the melee ability. Normally in Alpha Strike, if you want to make a physical attack, you have to be within 1 inch of your target. Melee allows you to be within 2 inches, and that is to represent that he has a handheld melee weapon, and it's also easier for him to hit in melee than most other mechs. All right, so back to movement. He's got the 8 inches we covered. He can move just 8 inches flat. If he's moving through a forest, it costs him an additional inch for each inch. If you want to climb up something, like say he doesn't have jump jets and he wants to move up this building, it costs an additional inch, or it's every 2 inches per inch of elevation that you're going up. So if he wants to move 1 inch forward and 2 inches up, that's going to be 5 inches of his movement just to get on top of this building. Or, you know, he could jump because he's a hatchet man and he has jump jets. If you're moving through rough terrain, which I actually don't have any set out, rough terrain is the same in that it costs you additional movement to move through, like woods, like water. It's an additional point of movement. So say he had 1 inch of movement left at the end here, or 2 inches left of movement here, he could only move 1 inch into the rubble. Same goes for the forest. Now water, you have to determine what the depth of the water is before time. So we would say like this is depth 1 water. He would have to pay for that elevation change as well. So he has to pay an additional 2 inches for moving down an inch in elevation to move into the water, as well as an additional inch for moving through the water. So for our hatchet man to move 1 inch into water, he has to spend 1 inch to move the 1 inch, and then 2 inches to move down a level, and then an extra inch for moving an inch through water. And that's going to cover about all of the movement possibilities you're going to see in the quick start rules. Now, as far as combat is concerned, oh wait, I forgot to cover running. You can sprint at 50% more than your maximum move. So he's got a movement of 8. If he wanted to run, he could do an additional 4. So he can actually move up to 12 inches in a run. But if you do that, you can't shoot. And it also doesn't actually give you any more TMM. It is strictly used to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, usually over open ground. You'll probably see it in a situation like this with buildings where, say, they are just far enough away that he can't make it from one point of cover to the next point of cover without sprinting. So you'll see it sometimes. Just remember, you can't shoot if you do that. And it doesn't increase your TMM at all. But it might help you to pass through rough terrain of some kind, or aid you in getting to cover fast. Or if you're playing like an objective type game, like some kind of capture the flag, you might have whatever has the flag just in an all-out sprint. He doesn't want to stop and fight. He's got to go. He has places to be. Combat phase. Combat is also really easy in this. So first, you need to verify a line of sight. And to verify that line of sight, you actually get down at eye level with the mech, and you verify if they can see the target. So let's say he's shooting at this fire starter. I would lean down, hello there, and I would look at about his head level to see if he can see the fire starter. And he can. It's totally out in the open, so he has a clear line of sight. Now, if a mech is partially hidden behind something, if more than a third of it is hidden, then they get +1 for partial cover. So right now, looking from the Hatchet Man at the fire starter, a little bit more than a third of the fire starter is in cover. So he would get a +1 on, or the Hatchet Man would have to take a +1 on the roll to shoot the fire starter because he's in cover. If more than 2/3 are behind cover, it's considered to be out of sight and doesn't count as line of sight. Now, if there is a dispute on whether or not they have line of sight, verify with the defender. Ultimately, if it's close, it is the defender's choice, but the defender also has to remember that that line of sight works in both directions. You want to verify the firing arc next after verifying that you have line of sight. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot about woods. If you are shooting through woods, woods are super easy. If you're shooting through woods, it's a +1 to hit. If they're standing in woods, it's a +1 to hit, but they don't get both. So just because I'm shooting through woods and into something shooting woods, he doesn't get +2. He just gets +1 for standing in woods. Now, woods will block line of sight if there is 6 inches or more of woods between the target. So right now, there's more than 6 inches of woods. So the Hatchet Man and Firestarter can't actually see each other in this situation. Level 1 water does not block line of sight, but it does provide partial cover. So if the Firestarter is standing in level 1 water, then the Hatchet Man can see him, but half of the Firestarter is covered, so he gets a +1. Firestarter shooting out of the water, he can see all of the Hatchet Man. If this is depth 2 water, what happens is most mechs are only 2 inches high or 2 levels high, so neither of them would be able to see each other anymore standing in the water. I think mech-to-mech combat in water, they both have to, like if one of them is completely submerged, he can only shoot at other mechs that are submerged. Water has some other benefits as well that we'll cover in the heat section, as water helps with heat. Then you want to determine range. Range in Alpha Strike is split into short, medium, long, and extreme. You're hardly ever going to see extreme until you've been playing this a bunch. But it breaks down actually very nicely with the measuring strip provided in the quick start rules. Short range is anything up to 6 inches. Medium range is anything up to 24. And then long range is up to 42. So 6, 24, 42. Beyond that, it's extreme range, and you won't see that in the basic, the quick start rules, or even the standard rules. It's more of an extra thing that some people like to play with. So in this case, the Hatchet Man and the Firestarter, you'd measure base to base, definitely outside of 6 inches, but we are within 24, so this is medium range. If the Firestarter were here, we'd be in short range. If they were base-to-base contact, that is physical range, and you actually can't shoot at something in physical range of you. You have to melee it. Say we were going from corner to corner, making a nice long shot. This would be long range, which doesn't help the Hatchet Man at all because he doesn't have a long-range weapon, so he wouldn't be able to fire on that fire starter at all. Once you're ready to make the attack, you declare it. When you are doing your attacks in Alpha Strike, whoever lost initiative makes all of their attacks, and then the player that won initiative makes all of their attacks. Doesn't matter if one of the players' mechs would take damage that destroys it before they get to fire, because none of the damage takes effect until the end of the combat phase. And that's when mechs would actually be destroyed and removed from the field. So let's do a couple of checks here. We've got a Hatchet Man firing on the fire starter. They are in medium range from one another. And you have a couple of different modifiers at different ranges. At short range, you've got a modifier of 0. Medium range, you've got a modifier of 2. Long range, you have a modifier of 4. So actually, let's go ahead and start off with them in short range of one another. Now, to figure out what your target number is, we follow SATOR, which is skill, attacker modifier, target movement, target modifier, other modifiers, and range modifier. Now, on our Hatchet Man, we can see that he has a skill of 3. So that's what we use for our skill. Oh, and here's a fire starter. So he's got a skill 3. That's our S. Attacker modifier, say he just walked, that'll be a 0. If he jumped, he would take that +2 penalty to it. If he's taken some fire control hits, that could also affect it with the attacker modifier. But so far, he's got a skill of 3, no attacker modifiers. Target modifiers, let's say that the fire starter moved at least an inch. He has a TMM of 2. So now we're at skill 3. Still 3, there's no attacker modifiers. Up to 5 because of the fire starter's TMM. Any other modifiers, which would be like terrain modifiers, there's nothing in between them, so there's no terrain modifiers, so we're still at 5. And then we also need to look at range. We're in short range, so there's no other modifier there. So the Hatchet Man would need to roll a 5 to do the damage shown under short range. We roll, it's a 4. He misses a shot at short range and doesn't do any damage to the fire starter. Now, if we were to move the fire starter out to say, let's do this. Put the Hatchet Man here. Let's put the fire starter here. So now they're in medium range from each other. Less than 6 inches of woods. And let's also say that the Hatchet Man jumped. So 3, another 2 puts us at 5 from the jump. Target, say he moved and got his TMM, so that's another 2. We're at 7 now. Other modifiers, he's standing in woods. That's 8. And then we're also, for the range of medium, that's another 2. So suddenly our target number becomes 10. And this can add up very quickly. And with the bell curve of 2d6, you are most likely to roll a 7. And then it gets more and more rare to get any number away from a 7. So rolling a 10 is actually pretty darn hard. So this fire starter is pretty well defended right now. Had the Hatchet Man walked instead of jumped, this would be 2 easier, and suddenly it's an 8, which is a much more reasonable number. Hey, he hits. So at medium range, he would do 2 damage to the fire starter. We'd come over here and we'd mark off 2 pips on the fire starter. Once they're out of armor, then they start taking damage on their structure. If they do happen to take a critical hit, which can happen one of 2 ways, and first we'll cover the main way, which is they take structure damage. Now they only make 1 critical roll for each attack made against them that does structure damage. So say he takes 2 damage to his structure from 1 attack from the Hatchet Man, he's still only going to roll that crit just once, and the attacker makes that roll to see what the crit is. That's on our determining critical hits table. We'd roll. It's a 4. We check it. Fire control hit, and we'd mark off the fire control marker on here, which going forward after this combat phase, it gives the Firestarter a permanent +2 to hit on everything that is not a physical or melee attack. If I were to roll 12s to hit the Firestarter, that's an automatic critical hit. So I would also get to roll a critical hit for that. Now you do get to roll both for the 12 and also for the structure damage. You can also get a critical hit on a 12 even if they're fresh. So say he hasn't been hit before, he still has 3 armor, I'm only doing 2 damage to him, but I rolled a 12, I still get to roll a hit. That's a through armor critical. So there is some possibility here that you can kill a fresh mech on your first attack. You roll a 12 against it, and then you roll either a 2 or a 12, which is an ammo hit or unit destroyed, respectively. The unit destroyed is effectively a headshot, and you kill the pilot. Ammo hit, any mechs that don't have the energy special, case or case 2, will immediately be destroyed by an ammo hit. If you have energy or case 2, you're fine. If you have case 1, you take an additional point of damage. But those 3 skills are critical to not dying to an ammo hit. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, you'll wish that you have those specials. But, you know, sometimes you might not have the points for it. And case isn't especially common in certain eras. It also depends on what era you're playing in, if you agree to play within a specific era, which I recommend because that will help to further balance the game. The PV does a lot for you, but there's also some flavor in playing within certain eras. It's not super critical. And, you know, through salvage, all things are possible. And that's it for combat. Oh, firing arcs. Firing arcs are important. So, from the back edge, and this is why it's important to have either square or hexagon bases for your mechs. From the back edge, anything along that line and in front of it is within your firing arc. So say I've got this Firestarter like way over here. You can trace the line from the back edge, and the Firestarter is still in front of it. If the Firestarter were over here, he would be outside of my firing arc, and my Hatchet Man could not fire on him. Now, you do get an extra point of damage for shooting somebody in the back. And it's hard to show with these square ones, but on a hexagon, it has to pass through only that back edge. So with a hexagon, you've got 6 sides, and if it's passing through one of the sides adjoined to that back edge, like you draw a line from the center of the base through the center of the base, it has to pass through only that back edge to get the additional point of damage. And then there's additional modifiers that are mentioned in the rules. I definitely recommend taking a look at them, but that's most of it. You don't get a bonus for having the high ground. Hatchet Man doesn't get any kind of bonus here on his shots against the Firestarter, nor does the Firestarter suffer from being on a lower ground than the Hatchet Man. Having the high ground is useful because you have improved firing lines, but you also have to remember that other things are going to be able to see you better as well. Heat. Let's cover heat. During the combat phase, this is great that I've got the Firestarter out. If we look at the Firestarter's card, he has a special called Heat, and he has 1/dash/dash. And that means he does 1 point of heat at short range, none at medium, none at long. And that's to represent that he has flamers. If the Firestarter damages another mech in short range, that mech takes a point of heat. What heat does is at that first point of heat, they lose 2 inches of movement. They lose 2 inches of movement for each point of heat that they have. it becomes +1 harder for each point of heat that they have to shoot at something. And then at 2 heat, they also become 1 easier to hit. If you hit S, then that means you shut down at the end of turn, and then you miss the entirety of your next turn while your heat is erased. You can also deal with heat through a couple of other manners. If you are standing in water, and this is what I wanted to mention in the quick start rules. The quick start rules say that you need to be standing in depth 2 or deeper water for it to help sink your heat. That's not true. It only has to be depth 1. Depth 0 won't help you at all. I don't know if that's just a weird errata thing or if it's a typo. The quick start rules are kind of old, but I highly recommend playing it with depth 1 or deeper. Sinks a point of heat at the end of turn. If you fire during your turn, like say the Hatchet Man has a point of heat on him and he shoots, he will not lose any heat. The heat will stay the same. If it were something that can overheat to do damage, like I think the Warhammer can, he could spend a point of heat to get additional damage on his attack. You have to make that decision before you roll. You do that when you declare the attack. If you're standing in water, you automatically sink a point of heat, which means something like the Warhammer that has OV1 can stand in here, get a free extra point of damage, and then still sink that heat at the end of turn. And then if you don't shoot at all, that will reset your heat to 0. There's a couple other things that can cause you to heat. If you take an engine hit, you will automatically gain a heat any turn that you fire your weapons, and that takes effect on that same turn. So if he were to take an engine hit during the combat phase, during the end phase, if he fired, he would still get a point of heat. That one doesn't take place on the next turn. That one starts that turn. And I think that's it for combat. During the end phase, that's where all of the damage inflicted actually takes effect. That's when mechs get removed from the field. That's when you do all of your heat stuff. That's when a mech shuts down if it needs to. A shutdown mech is at -4 to hit and cannot move or shoot the entirety of the next turn. So getting a shutdown on another mech is pretty darn great. And we covered cooling down. And that's it. There's a couple of special abilities here. I think I might have covered all of them, actually. We covered Case, we covered Case 2, we covered Energy, we covered Heat, we covered the Melee ability. This says it also adds an additional point of physical damage on a successful melee attack. So that's awesome. I don't see melee happen too much. We got a lot of people running clanners. Clanners don't like melee. Clanners like to abuse their range. So that's how to play. It's a very quick and simple game to play. I probably could have parsed this down a lot faster, but if you read the quick start rules, it's incredibly quick to come together. All of the complexity in this game comes from force building and terrain and finding your way around the terrain and dealing with force building, and specials can add some flavor to it. Infantry, tanks, VTOLs, a lot of that plays very similar to this with a couple different flavors to it. But right here, right now, we can play all sorts of different games of BattleTech Alpha Strike. And next time, we're going to do the Green Scenario Training Day and play our first game. So, as always, I'm your host, Steven, also known as Seigencat, and thank you for joining me, everybody. I'll see you next time on We Slay Dragons.